All right, we are going to get started. My name is Liam Dillon. I am the other half of Gimme Shelter, the other half of the most popular podcast on California housing issues.
All right.
Sometimes in this, I'd like to say the state, but often it's probably true.
The known universe.
The known universe, most popular podcast on California housing, right here, live, right now.
There's only one.
So thank you so much for joining us. We have a great episode planned today. Like per usual, Matt and I are going to banter a bit first about the state of housing at the state level. And then we also have a couple of fantastic guests who will be joining us shortly. Mayor Catherine Blakespear from the city of Encinitas, and also State Assemblyman Todd Gloria from San Diego.
So we're going to do a little summary of all the major state housing legislation and executive actions that Governor Gavin Newsom has at least initiated on housing. It was a really big year. In housing,
big promises this year.
Yes, big promises this year too. So we're going to do this through the lens of what did Gavin Newsom achieve.
Yeah.
Liam and I both had pieces kind of evaluating the Newsom administration on housing ahead, or I had mine, a few weeks back, you dropped yours.
This past week.
Liam was ruthless.
Right.
Is that fair?
That's totally fair, yeah.
I was more generous to the governor, but we'll sum up everything that's been done and then how those decisions at the state level have kind of filtered out to some of the things you're seeing here in San Diego.
So should we start with the big promises?
Yeah, start with the promises.
So the governor on the campaign trail in his first few months of office, and I said this in the event we had earlier this morning, said basically we're going to do everything humanly possible to fix this housing crisis in California, which was a marked difference, frankly, from his predecessor, Jerry Brown, who said, this might be unsolvable. I mean, that was pretty much in his exit interviews. He was often asked about, hey, housing's so bad, it got so bad during your tenure. What do you think about that? And he was like, capitalism, man, tough, you know? And so...
Tougher in climate change.
Tough, yeah. So Gavin Newsom says, no, we're going to really take steps to really try to fix this. And so he's put forward an extraordinarily ambitious plan. Most prominently suggested the state needed to build 3.5 million new homes between now and 2025. So that's 500,000 a year. And to give people some sort of context for that, that's more than 4 times what the state is building now on an annual basis, and the most that would have happened in the state since at least the mid-1950s, and he wanted it to do it 7 years in a row. So a gigantic plan, right? He also, in one of his early addresses, I think it was the inaugural, there are many addresses at the beginning of the year.
Marshall Plan?
The Marshall Plan, yeah.
Yeah.
Called for a Marshall Plan for affordable housing, evoking the United States efforts to rebuild Europe after World War II. So, gigantic plans.
Yes. So here's some of the things that he has actually gotten done in concert with some California lawmakers. One other kind of promise he made was after the rent control initiative that probably many of you voted on last year, after that failed pretty overwhelmingly, Newsom came out and said, I want to broker some type of deal between tenants and landlords. And he did. He signed into law a couple weeks back, AB 1482, a bill by Assemblymember David Chu from San Francisco, which caps annual rent increases at about 5% plus inflation. Also includes a host of just cause or a host of eviction protections that the vast majority of California renters never enjoyed before. This is probably the biggest feather in Newsom's cap, I would say, in terms of housing legislation that not only got a lot of publicity here in California, but made national news.
Yeah, I would also agree, and you could actually see the influence of the governor in this, that perhaps some of the other legislation or things was not as apparent. You know, there was very much a weaker version of this rent cap legislation that was active over the summer. Newsom comes out and says, this should be stronger. And in fact, the bill got stronger. And that almost never happens. You know, the way things happen in the legislature is you introduce a bill and it's super strong, and then everyone says, oh my God, this is so strong. What about all these things? And it gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. In this case, it went the other direction and got stronger.
I think Assemblyman Gloria politely disagrees, but...
That's the way things work, you know? A number of your bills, that's happened too. Okay, yes.
One of the other things Newsom said he wanted to do was crack down on cities. So cities, you got to plan for more housing. We got to build more housing. Stop being an impediment to new housing. I feel like that was probably a theme of various other panels you've attended today. Probably the signature bill in that respect was Senate Bill 330 from Democrat Nancy Skinner from Berkeley, which I have been calling glibly the moratorium on moratoriums bill. Basically, it prohibits cities from imposing a moratorium on new housing, which some cities have done in the past. It also imposes a host of new requirements on cities to make it tougher for them to change the terms of an agreement with a developer, basically. A city can no longer arbitrarily increase the fees associated with a specific project. A few other provisions there meant to keep cities from obstructing new housing.
Okay. Third thing is, there was a lot more money put into the budget this year for both housing and homeless initiatives. It's often hard to count. Do you count money that goes towards mental health care? Should that be a homelessness provision, right? So it's hard to get a real exact figure for what you want to encompass everything. But the number that's typically thrown out there is about $3 billion, $2.75 billion in new money this year towards housing and homelessness initiatives that was not there in years past. This is money that's going to subsidize new low-income development. This is money that's going to help cities around the state plan for further growth. That's another $650 million to cities to help cities and counties to help with their homelessness efforts, and so that was some of the big ticket items in that amount.
And when we're talking about especially state money, we throw billions of dollars figures out there, and everything seems to cost billions of dollars, right? But when you talk to homelessness and housing advocates, especially homelessness, they will tell you this is the biggest one-time appropriation of homelessness funds we can remember, period, or at least over the last few decades. So it's a lot of money. Now, Newsom was operating with a huge budget surplus, so I don't know how much credit he should deserve for that type of thing, but nevertheless, the money was appropriated. Okay, Liam, what did he not do?
What did he not do, right? So I'm a big believer that you judge people in two regards, right?
You judge people in a lot of regards,
right,
but keep going.
Principally two regards in this case. One being, did the people do what they say they were going to do, right? Like they set the standard, let's judge them by the standard they set for themselves. And B, is this going to fix a problem, right? And look, I'm not the one who promised 3.5 million new homes in the next 7 years. I'm not the one who evoked, war-era sacrifice and victory gardens and the like to rebuild California's housing crisis. And in that regard, I think the governor almost certainly fell short. There was no signature measure to increase housing production at the level that he was calling for. The money, while a lot, as we mentioned, significantly more, was still far short of what needs are just to take care of the sort of most vulnerable residents, on the order of magnitude of billions of dollars short. And so he had a number of other promises. He originally said, we're going to go after cities with their state transportation dollars if they don't approve enough housing. That plan fell by the wayside. I could keep going. There were a few other things. But by those metrics, he didn't get it done. And there are areas, Senate Bill 50 is probably most prominent. That was legislation that would have called for increasing density around transit stops in single-family neighborhoods across the state. The governor did not take a public position on that, and rather only after it was shelved did he say that he was disappointed in it not moving forward. And so by those metrics, he didn't do what he said.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that the ultimate metric by which Gavin Newsom will be judged on his housing agenda will be very, very personal to voters. It'll be how much they're paying in rent. It'll be, can they afford a home? It'll be, do I still see people experiencing homelessness down the street? And it is, he's only been in office now for 10 months. It's October.
10 months.
Yeah. So, you can't, I don't think you can judge him fairly yet on those numbers, but those numbers are trending in the wrong direction, right? So, referring to that 500,000 a year new unit figure, California is on pace this year for, some of the numbers have been changing recently, but around 90,000 units, which is far short of his goal and far short of what the state says we need to average, basically 180,000 new units just to keep pace with current demand. Now, we are checking ourselves to make sure we don't drone on too long because we can't edit this podcast because it's live.
Yeah.
Should we move on to
I think we could still go a couple more banter.
Okay, Liam loves hearing his own voice, so we'll go a little bit longer.
You just took me off my train of
Sure.
thought, But I will make one more point, and then we'll move on. And the governor knows this, and I think everybody involved in housing policy knows this. You rezone parcel of land for 1,000 units that used to have one on it tomorrow. Even if you found a developer tomorrow to say, yes, I want to build those 1,000 units, we may not see them for 5 years, for 10 years, for a variety of reasons, right? That are many of them outside of the control of any government, right? Or certainly the state government or any local government. And so as a result, if you don't make gigantic changes early on in your term, the kind of big numbers that you would like to see in terms of actual production later on, it's impossible. It's actually impossible for that to happen. And so another reason I think, well, I agree that you can't judge the governor 10 months into his tenure. 5 years from now, the changes that may have been done this year were not, then we would be able to see them come to fruition. And another year to wait, it might take another year for those the number of housing to come online.
So on the production portion of it, Governor Newsom, while he was signing the rent cap bill and a few other bills, repeatedly said next year production. I'm paraphrasing, but next year production. You hear the same chorus from California lawmakers as well. We did some tenant stuff this year. Next year, we're going to do production. So we'll see what happens next year. All right, should we move on?
Let's move on. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Catherine, do you want to come on stage? Little round of applause for the mayor of Encinitas.
Yeah.
Mayor of Encinitas.
Yeah.
That wasn't a good introduction. I'm sorry. You want to introduce our segment?
Yeah, so I used to live in San Diego for many years. I used to work at Voice of San Diego, and I loved Encinitas. It's so pretty. And Matt had never been, and we were driving by last night. I said, oh, there's Encinitas. And so we were able to have that conversation and then begin planning for today's episode last night. So
what a moment.
Yes. So we have this segment where we talk about, we should do it the way we always do because
sure.
our listeners and fans are expecting this kind of delivery.
Our countless fans.
Yeah.
So we have a segment called okay, hold on. So it is now time for the
avocado of the fortnight.
Our look at the most absurd California housing story of the past few weeks. This was inspired by an Australian developer who said, the reason millennials can't buy homes is because, I'm a millennial, so I'll say, we spend too much money on avocado toast, which made national news, of course, empirically true.
Yes.
So each fortnight, each 2 weeks, we take a look at one of the most absurd California housing stories, and this is our first live avocado. And Liam, I'll let you give a little context to ask the mayor about it.
Yes, so Encinitas, when I first started writing about housing issues at the state, I asked the state, tell me what communities in the state have never had a compliant state housing plan. So every 8 years, the state says to every community in the state, every city and county, zone land for X number of housing units to meet demand in your community. And while there are many cities and counties who hem and haw and say no, only one reasonable sized city in the state has never had or had never had a state compliant housing plan, and that was the city of Encinitas. And so recently you guys did a number of things to come into compliance, and that's caused a bit of a strange event. You folks decided to sue some of your own residents over this. Is that right?
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you to the audience for coming and listening today to this. They barely gave me any notice about the topic we would be talking about. I knew it would be housing, but so in Encinitas, in order for us to upzone, we have to take it to the voters for approval. So in our last housing cycle, we took them 2 plans, and they rejected both of them. The voters did. And we spent a lot of time and energy especially on the second plan, trying to make it as inclusive as possible. So involving the opponents to sit on the committee, doing every meeting in public, having as big a tent as possible to say, what is it that would make it so that you could accept more density in the city of Encinitas, which is 80% single-family zoning. So the rest of it is commercial and light industrial. So we basically have almost no multifamily zoning right now, and that is what low-income housing largely is. And so the result of that was a series of pretty substantial lawsuits. So the state did not sue us, but the Building Industry Association did, and low-income housing advocates. And part of getting ourselves out of the lawsuits, we really didn't have any good reason not to have a housing plan, was we needed to commit to the state that we would deal with what's called a constraint of the vote requirement. So the constraint of the vote requirement was that in order for us to comply with state housing laws, we have to go to the voters to get their approval. And if we happen to fall out of compliance for some reason, like for example, if a property develops at a lower density than it's supposed to, which can happen over a series of different properties, and then we could fall out of compliance, the state law says that we have to get ourselves back into compliance within 180 days. And we couldn't go to the voters in 6 months. It just wouldn't be possible to do. So we are going to the court to say, when it comes to housing element compliance, so state required upzoning, does the vote requirement apply? And the reality of filing this cause of action is that you have to have a defendant. You can't file a cause of action without having a defendant. And we chose, our defendant is this organization called Preserve Prop A, which had attempted to intervene in previous lawsuits, these housing lawsuits, to preserve the vote requirement. And we wanted to give them an official seat at the table. So make your best argument. We're going to streamline things. We're not looking for any sort of monetary relief. We're looking for clarity from the court on whether we have to go to the voters for future upzoning that's required by the state.
And just to be 100% clear, they are not suing for monetary damages from these citizens. They're naming them as a defendant in court. But
it's still extraordinary. I mean, I'd never heard of this.
I'd never heard of this before. Yeah.
So what?
Well, it's admittedly not ideal. But, but there are lots of parts of this. I mean, I've been in elected office for 5 years, and the most difficult thing has been housing, and continues to be. And I was speaking on housing last week for about 60 people that live in Encinitas, and there continues to be a very strong undercurrent of commitment to the type of community that we have historically been. And so embracing multifamily housing and apartments is not something that a lot of people are accepting yet. So it's important that we in elected office, and my council member, Kelly Shahinsey, is here as well. It's important that we are all communicating that community character really comes back to who lives in your community. It's being open to the artists and the seniors and the youth, the people that we think make up our community character. But people very traditionally think of their community character just as being the built environment, and if it's single-family homes, then there's a sense that we should keep it that way.
I actually just want to drill in on one thing, which is, you said you've been in office for a little while now, 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I've been the mayor 3 years, and council 2 years before that.
So we had another live podcast yesterday with the mayor of Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills has a reputation in the Los Angeles area being a hotbed of resistance to new development, similar in the way that Encinitas has a reputation for being a hotbed of resistance to new development. How are you still mayor?
Well, it's an interesting question. So my family has been contributing to the Encinitas community for almost 100 years. So I'm fourth generation. And that connection and understanding about what it is that makes community character and how important it is, I think is an important part of my personal story. But it's also, I'm a progressive person who's very environmentally oriented. And I'm outdoorsy and sporty and young with a family. And I think all of those things resonate for a lot of people in the city.
So in, I believe it was February, the governor, after suing another city that has a reputation for being slow growth, Huntington Beach in Orange County, over allegedly violating these same housing laws we've been discussing, kind of called a bunch of other cities who at that point were out of compliance sort of to the principal's office, if you will, for meetings with him to talk about their individual situations. You were one of the mayors who showed up. What was that like?
Yeah, well, that was really interesting. There were probably 20 cities and the governor, the brand new governor, and what was clear to me is that most of the cities were not like us. So we all have a high degree of sophistication about the housing element laws because of the lawsuits that we've been involved in. And some of the other cities, the elected representatives, they didn't even know what a housing element is. So it was like they were trying to keep the lights on, they had bankruptcies, they had financial problems. You don't just get yourself a housing plan. So it costs money. You have to have a consultant go out there and put together the plan. And some of them, it really just had not been a priority. And so hearing the different reasons, or for example, they didn't have the infrastructure because the town was expanding. There were a lot of different reasons that cities didn't have housing plans, but nobody else was it because their voters had rejected housing plans.
So did that make you feel better or worse about your situation?
Well, it made me feel like all of our problems are mostly political, so they're not financial, and that made me feel grateful, I have to say.
What else?
Yeah, I got stuff. Okay.
Okay.
So it sounds to me from what you're saying, though, you think that even if the state weren't around to say, hey, Encinitas, you have to do this, it sounds like you believe there should be more multifamily housing in your city. Is that right?
Well, yeah, and I believe we should have housing for all income levels. And I think it's become more and more clear that when we have exclusionary zoning, which is zoning that only allows people who can afford homes to live in your city, that you are not providing a place to live for everybody. And it's seniors, it's people aging, it's the youth, it's people who are coming back home to their communities after college, and it's everybody in between. I mean, we are all experiencing the homelessness crisis, which is fundamentally they do not have a home, right? So if you really go back to that, I mean, it really blows my mind when I receive emails, and I do get these periodically, where somebody in the same email is saying they don't understand why it is that we're ruining the community by allowing development, and particularly these homeless people living all over the street are a disaster, and you should get rid of them. So it's like the lack of connection for some about the fact that homes help people not live on the street, I think is something that we need to do a better job educating people about.
What is Encinitas doing about its homelessness issues?
Well, we are moving forward with an actual plan instead of having it. The way that I think of it is that we've had a bit of it's like a little fire will start and we'll have a fire hydrant and we'll spray it. Like we have an approach to, well, if we have a problem, there's the sheriff and we have the community resource center, but we haven't had a comprehensive plan about it. One of the things I'm really excited about is a safe parking opportunity. So it would allow 25 cars to park overnight, and it's controlled, so you have to be sober and check in, and you have to leave by 7 in the morning, can check in at 6 at night, because people are sleeping on our streets in their cars, and there is nowhere in North County that's a safe parking structure.
So Encinitas is about 60,000 residents?
Yeah, about 63,000.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then what's the homeless population?
It's
roughly?
about
Last count?
125 people,
Okay.
according to the point-in-time count, and that's been stable for the last 4 years.
Okay.
So we haven't seen a big spike, but it's important to me as the mayor to get in front of this, because when I look forward 5 years, I see this as the biggest problem. I do not want us to have tent cities in our city, and I think that it's not only, obviously it's a humanitarian problem for the people who are living on the street, which you can't think of anything worse, really, when you think about that. But it's also a quality of life issue for all the other people who want to walk on the sidewalks and be at the beaches and to not have people and the sanitary conditions associated with that. We really have to be willing to make the hard. I think fundamentally homelessness is hard because it's hard to build homes, which you can see we have in Encinitas, but it's really hard to build homeless shelters, and it's really hard to have anything in between. And so we need to be having those things in between, where we're saying, what are we doing for people that makes it easier for them to not be living on the street?
A lot of discussion in Sacramento the past few years is centered on the relationship between the state and local government over housing. And it's more than just housing, it's also about power, right? Who has the power to say yes or no to a variety of things, and what is the state's responsibility versus the local government's responsibility. What to you is the ideal relationship between state and cities on this issue?
You know, I honestly think that's a fraught question, because I think that as a local elected and a mayor, I want to solve the problems I see, but I also recognize how difficult it can be when there are a lot of different interests that are opposed to it. So I understand why it is that we haven't been able to build the housing, because we do have such a clear opposition from lots of people on any individual project. And even the fact that we had a vote requirement for upzoning. I mean, it's not coincidental that the 5th housing cycle was due in 2014, and that was the year that the vote requirement was passed. I think those things are very closely linked. And a lot of people go back to their own personal experience. So they're saying, what does my commute look like? What is the parking outside my house? What is my perception of poverty and density and quality of life and what I've earned? And unless you can be able to look more holistically and have an understanding of what our societal problems are, I think it's very hard to get people to, that's not their job. Their job is not to solve all these problems. They're doing their other jobs. So where is the balance in who gets to make the decision, I think is a really difficult question.
What would be the best thing that the state could do to make your job easier, encouraging more housing in Encinitas?
Oh, I really don't know. I mean, in some ways, it's above my pay grade, because I feel like there are lots of different housing bills, and there are some that I don't think would be right for my community, and I do represent my city, and so I'm not charged. I'm not the governor. I'm not charged with solving all of these problems, but I do feel charged with doing the best I can in my city and represent, and then in my role at Sandag on the transportation board as well.
So if the state came in and said, hey, we're going to take away some of your power to set your own zoning, or at least force you to zone more densely, would that be a good thing or a bad thing for you?
Well, in some ways that's already happened, right? Because
Right.
that is what a housing element is. Yeah. I think it's been more aspirational historically, and that hasn't produced the results. Like you showed a slide in an earlier panel that you showed a slide, yeah. But that really shows for how many years we haven't been building anywhere near the housing we need, and the results of that are the overcrowding and the poverty and the 3-hour-long commutes and the homelessness. And so that isn't what we want in our society. I don't think anybody does. And I think as the housing crisis has started to affect not just the middle class, but the upper middle class, how many of those people are spending 50% of their income on housing, that has started to really change the picture.
That was actually my slide, right?
No,
Yeah,
we shared slides.
Yeah, that was the slide I created and then you took for the...
You know, we're one in many ways, Matt.
We are.
Yeah.
Should we?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, so we'd also like to welcome up to the stage our second guest, Assemblyman Todd Gloria from San Diego. Thank you.
Good to see you.
This is fulfilling a lifelong ambition to be on the Gimme Shelter podcast. I've made it, Ma. This is so exciting.
Lifelong. That's great.
Can you say casita for me in person?
Oh, wow. This
is really directed at this one.
Buttering us up here. Wow. Casita. There we go.
I love it.
Thank you.
All right,
Yeah.
my day is complete.
So with that, now I'm all flustered and can't get through my questions. But with that introduction, so Assemblyman, you, before joining the state legislature a few years ago, you were on the city council in San Diego. So what is the difference in how you perceive housing issues from the local perspective and now having spent some time with the state as well?
That's exactly something I think a lot about, right? Because the constant conversation about local control versus whatnot. I think what I've come to understand in the 3 years I've been in Sacramento is the size and scale of this particular problem, and that in the case of my home community, San Diego, we can't solve the entirety of the housing crisis. And so there does require state interventions because everyone has to do their fair share. And that's difficult. That's really hard, particularly from a consistency standpoint. I remember railing against the state for ending redevelopment and saying all kinds of unpleasant things about the state of California. But then fast forward to today where we have a housing crisis that is statewide in scope. I think one of the first conversations I remember after getting to Sacramento was with a colleague of mine that represents a rural community in Central Valley. And I was surprised when she was sharing that they have a homeless problem. They have a housing affordability crisis. These are all issues that they face with that San Diegans and particularly coastal Californians probably wouldn't think would be the case. And I think it illustrates that this is statewide in scope and therefore there are statewide interventions that are probably necessary.
So you kind of know exactly how hard it was to get that rent cap bill passed. You were on the Assembly Housing Committee where the first incarnation of the bill came through your way, and then you were obviously on the floor and voted for the measure. It starts going into effect in January, but a lot of tenant groups are already saying this doesn't go far enough. The cap is too generous to landlords. A rent increase of 7 to 8% a year is still going to mean a lot of people are going to have to lose where they're currently living. I'm wondering if you agree with that, or whether you would want to tighten some of the provisions in this rent cap law.
No, I actually became a fan of this bill. I voted for it in committee and it whipped the votes for it on the floor of the assembly. And I think to your question, Matt, is that when we have both maybe the California Realtors Association very upset about this bill and assorted tenant groups that are upset about this bill, I think we struck perhaps a reasonable compromise. And now, is this a panacea? It clearly isn't. But is this the most significant tenant bill that has been passed in recent state history? It is. And as a renter myself, I went back and looked at my own rent increases over the last number of years. I wouldn't be impacted by 1482, not because I live in a new building. I live in a really crummy old building, but my rent increases have been somewhere between 3% and 5%, so it wouldn't apply to me. But there has been reporting, I think a lot of San Diegans saw it, about apartment complexes that had nothing done to them, that just changed ownership and saw 75% or more increases for no change. I mean, this will be consequential for those folks. And so I think we've done something meaningful. But as was mentioned previously when you're talking in your intro, we had to start talking about production. That's necessary. I think it would have been better to do them combined. I think that would have been an easier pill for some folks to swallow. We might have been able to get a couple more votes. But we were able to get this tenant piece done. We need to come back and work with production.
How crummy is your apartment really?
Well, it looks like Jack Tripper from Three's Company could come walking through the door at any moment in time. I really like the faux rock on the front. I mean, it's just, beautiful chef's kiss. It's unchanged. I've lived in my apartment. I was trying to think about this the other day. I think about 5 years. Like, the carpet's the same, nothing's been done, it's all the same, but I'm paying significantly more than I was just a few years ago. And so, I'm often told about the market pressures on those who build housing. I'm kind of wondering about the market pressures on tenants, right? If I'm paying this much more, what more am I getting? And the answer is I have a roof over my head, which is better than a whole lot of folks. But I don't feel particularly good about paying as much as I do. And by the way, I make a good salary, so I realize I'm blessed in this situation, and I realize people pay a lot more than I do for less. So, to the extent that I feel fortunate in this situation, I think is a bit of the perversion of the problem we have in California, that you could make a good salary. I'm not complaining about what you all pay me, but I can't even own a home in my own district, right? That's the state of our current affairs. And again, I'm blessed. There are people who are far worse off, who we need to be mindful of when we're making bills and casting votes in Sacramento.
So we're going to get to some production stuff in a moment, but right before we leave the tenant issues, there is a potential, in fact, most folks in this room may, if they've gone to grocery stores recently, will have seen signature gatherers for a potential rent control ballot measure in next November. This would be much stricter than provisions that would be much stricter than what was just passed at the state level. Do you support that? You don't?
No.
Why not?
I think what we've done, is reasonable. I mean, I've historically opposed rent control. I didn't take a position on Prop 10 in the last year, recognizing that we're kind of in a crisis, and it felt a bit like you must let them eat cake if you say no. I think what we have done is a reasonable step. I think that it has to be matched with some production increases. If the problem doesn't get better, then maybe we should entertain some additional action. But for right now, I think that 1482 is a good way to prevent the most excessive and most egregious of rent increases in California.
I'm actually curious, Mayor Blakespear, do you support the 2020 rent control initiative?
No, and for the same reason.
Simon, you're also running for mayor of San Diego.
There's that, yeah.
There's that. So I'm going to put this in a bit of a context for that. Should you ultimately become mayor of San Diego, I suppose, again, because you were interim mayor for.
Thanks for remembering that.
Yeah. I was here too, so yeah. So
it was kind of a thing.
It was quite a time here. So in March, I did a panel much like this one with some Bay Area mayors.
I listened to that.
And I asked, maybe you'll know where this question's going then. I asked them all if they supported ending single-family only zoning in their communities. Libby Schaff from Oakland, Darrell Steinberg from Sacramento, both said yes. What's your response to that?
We're going to have to build a lot more housing. I don't think I'm affirmative yes at this point. I think when you look at the communities that have done this, it has been a part of a longer conversation, a deeper conversation, one that really speaks to the exclusionary nature of this. And I'm hoping in many ways today is the start of that for San Diego. We have a group here in San Diego, SD50, that is trying to build off of SB50 and starting that conversation. But when you look at when this has been done elsewhere, we're going to build a lot more housing, generally speaking, and I think that where that has to be done is in transportation corridors, near jobs, near existing infrastructure, and it has to be commensurate with our climate action plan, which really looks at driving down vehicle miles traveled. So there is a longer and deeper conversation that we have not had in San Diego, but I'm hopeful, and this race to date sort of indicates it's going to be a conversation about the future of housing in our community. I'm hopeful that we can get to a place where we're building a lot more housing in San Diego because we have to.
Do you think you can reach your own housing production goals in San Diego without getting rid of single-family only zoning?
Well, it'd be harder, but I don't believe we need to build anything anywhere. I think that we do have to build the kinds of products that are often smaller in nature, the kinds of duplexes and garden-style apartments like what I live in today, along with micro units and other kinds, the things I've written bills for in the legislature. So that is what I think is more likely to happen. There's a component of this around private property rights that I think is really important too, which kind of cuts both ways. But ultimately, I think we can do a lot more than what we're currently doing, and that can be with local initiative combined with state assistance. To your question before about what the state can do, a lot of resources would be helpful, and I was a co-author of Senate Bill 5 with the idea and intention of helping to incentivize cities to do this work, to really provide the infrastructure that's so commonly referenced when we talk about densifying existing built communities.
So that was a bill that would have revamped or revived a version of redevelopment, which was a program that allowed cities to sequester property tax revenue, funnel that to economic development or affordable housing. The legislature passed that bill and the governor vetoed it, citing cost and also saying, hey, if we're going to potentially spend $2 billion a year, we should talk about that through the budget. So you mentioned SD 50. Do you support SB 50? You potentially might vote on that or a similar piece of legislation next year?
Not as it's currently constituted. I've spoken with Senator Wiener and shared with some of the concerns that I have about the bill. I mean, I think we can get there eventually. He is, as you know, he's very persistent. And very intelligent, both from a policy perspective and political perspective. I think he can get there. What my concern is the sort of, I think context matters. I think one size fits all, and Liam, you know San Diego well. There's a big difference between a 5-story building on El Cajon Boulevard compared to University Avenue compared to Adams Avenue, right? I don't mind the production goals and the real desire to really force cities to make decisions, but I think that the way that is shaped and the way that is formed is difficult to encapsulate in a policy, but I think is important for getting it right. I think I also am chastened by the fact that I was elected in 2008, right at the start of the recession, and I served on the board of MTS, and we cut a lot of
that's the transit agency.
Transit agency here in San Diego, and we cut a lot of service. And I think that a part of what we have to do if we're concentrating this next to transit lines is to make sure that transit actually will be there in the long haul. And we have a measure on the ballot here in San Diego. We may have a measure on the ballot here in San Diego in 2020 to increase transit. I think that would go a long way to making sure that if the proximity to transit is the driver for more housing, we have to make sure the transit will be there and will be there for the long haul. And we need to find a way to encapsulate that in the policy as well.
So what specifically would you want to be in the bill that's not there now?
Well, I think for one example, actually, one of the things that we had a lot of conversation about, you may know they're building a multi-billion-dollar light rail line through my assembly district. The measurement of a quarter or a half a mile, when it's through topographical, geographic barriers to freeways and whatnot, I think it's more as you get the measurement is as you can maneuver as opposed to as the crow flies, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So
we're not flying crows.
We're not.
People.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think we're. I think we're providing jetpacks to constituents.
Sadly.
The future is uncertain, right? But I think it's important that when you're talking about that distance, that it's actually what people's lived experience looks like. And I think that's a modification that's fairly easy to make. The other one is, in terms of the transit question, obviously for light rail, that's a commitment, right? I mean, rail is there and it's not going to go anywhere. A bus could shift, right? And I worry a bit about what that looks like if the entitlement for a project was granted and the transit doesn't stay there long term. That's a way to undermine the confidence of the public in what we're trying to do. And I think what Catherine and I both have to do really demands that the public trust and believe that we're going to deliver on these promises.
I actually have a quick question for Catherine. I'm curious, from your perspective, whether all the attention that people like myself and Liam have paid to SB 50, Scott Wiener's bill, very controversial. Has that been good or bad for what you're trying to do in Encinitas?
Well, I think it's great to hear. I heard Scott Wiener this morning on your panel, and it's really useful to have somebody setting a North Star that seems pretty far off, but is a different vision. So saying, we don't want to see sprawl as the future of housing. We want to see densely packed communities around transit so that vehicle miles traveled go down so we don't create climate change through all the cars we're driving. And we don't want people to sit in hours of congestion. And I think that it's so great to have that because it does drive a lot of conversations about the specifics about like the crow flies and all this kind of stuff about how are you measuring half a mile. So all of that is the specifics of it. So I appreciate having a bigger conversation about it because it allows us to be more strategic, I think, and to be clear on where we want to go. And in the past, I don't think we've had that. I think that's kind of the nature of public policy is that there's a lot of rustling around at the bottoms before you really realize, like, okay, this is a North Star that we can aim toward. So I do find it useful.
The governor's from San Francisco. The Senator Wiener, who is also the chair of the Senate Housing Committee, is from San Francisco. David Chu, the author of the rent cap bill, is chair of the Assembly Housing Committee from San Francisco. Matt referenced earlier SB 330, that bill that is sort of the moratorium of moratoriums.
Berkeley.
Right. Berkeley legislator authored that. And initially, that initial version of this bill, you well know, would have messed with a San Diego voter-approved measure a number of years ago that calls for a 30-foot height limit around the coastline in San Diego. Obviously, a unique context here compared to other places. And you specifically objected to that. But I wonder what you think, and this could be for both of you, sort of this Bay Area lens that a lot of housing legislation, a lot of housing policy gets filtered through. How do you think that affects sort of how the state sees this issue in the rest of California?
So I've heard this theory of yours before.
Yes.
I don't know that I subscribe to it so much. I mean, in many ways, it's happenstance that these individuals are there. Obviously, they bring their lived experience of being Bay Area residents to this. But, you know, I mean, in the case of Senator Skinner, I mean, she was very responsive to the concerns that I raised that, frankly, aren't unique to San Diego. The notion was that the voters approved a particular thing, and you know, that's the highest office in a democracy, right? And undoing that through legislative action felt uncomfortable. And she was willing to accommodate that. And they don't have that in Berkeley, but she understood, listened, and made an adjustment. I think that's the current alignment, you know, and any things could change tomorrow. But I think that wouldn't change the fact that we still have a massive housing crisis. It wouldn't change the fact that we're gonna have to build a lot more housing if we want to address it.
Yeah, and I mean, you gave a statistic this morning that was 70% of the state is suburban. It was something like that.
So it's between 50 and 75% is zoned single family. Yeah.
Right. So that means that most people are living in suburban neighborhoods, not urban neighborhoods, and because single family zoning is by nature suburban, right? And so most representatives are coming from that. So to me, the Bay Area, they have as much suburban development as we do. I mean, maybe, yeah. So I don't really see that as being maybe a main driver.
At the same time, at least with Senator Wiener's bill, he has struggled to court some Southern California legislators to his cause.
That's quite a grin. You got that?
You're being very subtle, but yes, go ahead.
Why do you think that is? If there isn't that much of a difference between the crisis in the Bay Area and the crisis in Southern California?
I mean, that's some of the personalities that are involved. I mean, frankly, I don't. This is not the first. It wasn't SB 50. But remind me what it was last year.
827.
Right. So this is not our first time at the rodeo, right?
Right.
I mean, we've gone through this before, and some of it's personality driven. I think some of it is really about building support. I mean, would that have passed from, even if it got out of the Appropriations Committee, would it have passed the Senate? I don't know that it would have. On the Assembly side, I also don't know if the votes would have been there. So that's people from all across the state that are weighing in on this stuff. So again, I don't necessarily know the geographies there. I think that these people are in these positions, and you know, Scott is going to be persistent in this matter, and we will be able to figure out some way to land this plane. You know, I think reading Liam's reporting on this, I mean, the governor's involvement, as he said that he'll be involved, the pro tem's involvement, I think will go a long way to creating something that may be a better fit statewide. That's our challenge. You're doing this for inland, coastal, northern, southern. I mean, that's really hard to do, and that's an argument for local control. But I come back to the point of saying this is a statewide problem, and every community has to do its fair share.
So I hear this personality issues, and this is not just centered on this bill. Like, this is on a million different bills, a million different legislators, and a million different policy areas. But I'm always kind of chuckle when I hear that, because does that just mean like people don't like them, or like what? Like what? like what do you personality issues? I know I'm putting you on the spot because this is a regular thing, but like, what does that actually mean?
Scott's my buddy, so no problem with me.
Okay,
It's that I don't want to describe. Scott does a lot of big bills.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of big pieces of legislation, and often you're in a position of going to your colleagues and saying, "Hey, I need your vote on this." And it is not uncommon in human nature. Listen, I gave it the office, right? Is kind of the thing. And so I guess that's a part of what I'm talking about. I mean, a lot of it is the relationships. I mean, there's a reason why this business is spent. A lot of, we visit each other's districts. We try and get to know one another. We understand where they come from. As the majority whip, part of my job is understanding where each member is at and what their concerns are and what their priorities are. And so that's what I mean by it, is that everyone brings different sets of issues with them. They're dealing with different issues in their district. They have different pressures and sort of demands of their time. And I've seen it play out a million times. I mean, it could be the smallest of things that could make all the difference in whether or not someone pushes the yes or the no button. I mean, it's just, you're dealing with human beings. And I know that it doesn't always feel that way when you talk to some of us and whatever, but we are human at our core, and that it's an interesting exercise in watching people make decisions.
I will say I'm born and raised in the Los Angeles area, and when I hear a San Francisco legislator talk negatively about LA, even if they're correct, something inside just goes, I don't like that.
How do you feel about San Diegans doing it?
I don't know. I don't know what the San Diego version of that is.
That says so much about the state. But yeah.
I want to fast forward 5 years from now. I'm curious, Catherine, what do you think Encinitas will look like housing-wise 5 years from now?
Well, one of the things we've been really focusing on are our accessory dwelling units. So we've done a lot of things.
Is the preferred terminology.
But
It's not.
granny
Casita.
flats.
Casita.
Oh,
Yeah.
casitas.
Casita, yeah.
Okay, garden apartments.
Right, yes.
Yes.
It's
Mother-in-laws. Yeah. So the granny flats or the accessory units. Because we are predominantly single-family zoning, there's a lot of capacity for housing in the suburbs. And I really feel strongly that adding little houses here and there could add a lot of housing into neighborhoods that would have very little effect. And it would allow us also to have more of the social safety net that's within a family structure, provide for people, provide for the child who is just moving back after college and wants privacy but also wants connectivity, is looking for a job, or the older mother or mother-in-law who needs a place to live after the spouse dies. And also our homelessness crisis, having some way to keep people connected to a family structure, mental health reasons. There are all sorts of things, loneliness, depression, all sorts of things that would be benefited by us having a zoning structure that allowed more people to live together. And very much the single-family home is designed around 4 people, a husband, a wife, and 2 kids. And so really looking at multi-generational housing and the ways that we can make that possible is something we've been focusing on in Encinitas. So I see the city in 5 years as looking very similar to what it looks like, except for having a lot more homes in our existing suburbs, and then having some multifamily housing around our transportation corridors that will give more density and multifamily options like apartment complexes.
Have you seen an uptick in ADUs,
Absolutely.
granny flats now?
Well, yeah, and that's because of what we've done. So we have put together pre-approved plans. So we hired 2 different architects with different plans, and they have put together, if you want to build a studio or a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, and we put the plan out there on our website. You can download it, and it saves 6 to 8 months of permitting time. It also takes away all the uncertainty about whether you would be able to get that permitted. And we've waived all of our city fees, and we've expanded the envelope in which people can build on their lot. So, there were always these things, the rear yard setback, the side setback, these types of things. Can you convert your garage? We've streamlined all of that. And when you look at the graph from 2012 until now, we are going up exponentially. We were permitting fewer than 10 in 2012, and now we're up over 150. And these things have happened over multiple years through dedicated effort.
And are homeowners okay with that? I mean, there are some homeowner communities that absolutely do not like ADUs, but on the flip side, there's many who say, well, yeah, now I can build this thing right in the backyard.
Well, yeah, and fundamentally, I think the feeling I get the most from our community, from people who are opposed to housing, is an anti-developer sentiment. And ADUs, accessory dwelling units, give the value to the homeowner, because this isn't some speculator that's coming in and building right down the street from you and then getting out of town. It's the person who's able to now have a rental income of $1,000 or $2,000 a month. And it allows flexibility over a lifespan. So somebody who's invested in their home can have their home office there and then also have their nanny later, whatever the different things the situations are. So for the most part, I think you'll always have somebody who complains about the parking right outside their house or that kind of effect. But for the most part, I think it's really been embraced because of the reality that it gives the value back to the homeowner.
Let's ask Todd the same question. What does the city of San Diego in 5 years look like to you with the kind of housing production that you would like to see?
Well, there's going to be a lot more housing, hopefully. I mean, there would be housing of a more diverse type, certainly more multifamily. And even beyond that, I mean, I think what I'm struck by, I was at a youth summit just before this. I mean, those young people have a very different vision for what they want their housing to look like, and it's not a backyard and that kind of stuff, right? So I think we're responding in a world where there's more desire for choice and for freedom of choice, and so that's really incumbent upon us to find different housing products to provide to facilitate that choice. San Diego is a big city that often operates like a small town, and I think our future success really depends upon us embracing what we are, which is the 8th largest city in the United States, and acting accordingly. And if we do that, we will be a more urban community, but one that maintains. Because I reject the false choice that densification is somehow community eroding, or the community character is destroyed by that. In fact, I think that by doing this in a thoughtful fashion, in a more tailored fashion, allows you to actually get the housing that you need while maintaining what you like. And I think that's going to be a really difficult conversation over the next couple of years, but I'm game to have it because I recognize the alternative is a status quo, as Mayor Blakespeare is saying, more homeless people, more inequality, more social stratification, and that is not a great city. And you may know, Liam, you may remember our city motto is America's finest city, but I've always felt that bar is way too low. That's a C. I'm an A student, and we need to be great. And a great city is one that provides a variety of options for its residents, and it's critical for our economic success going forward.
Does Encinitas have a city motto?
I see an opportunity.
Do you want to
there
make
for-
one up right now?
Go for it right now.
Yeah, it seems
Perhaps crowdsource
there's too
here.
much hubris in saying you want to be the best in the world. I feel like we want to be the best version of ourselves.
Yes, we should
Good
end on
note
that
to end
sentiment.
on?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So please thank our guests, Assemblyman Todd Gloria, Mayor Catherine Blakespeare. And we come out every 2 weeks. Please subscribe to us, Gimme Shelter. You can find us on iTunes, your favorite housing podcastery, or rather podcastery site. We're there. I'm on Twitter if you want to follow me there, at Dylan Liam.
I'm on Twitter at MLevinReports. Also, if you want more housing coverage, subscribe to the LA Times, donate to CalMatters, donate to Voice of San Diego. There's only one housing reporter left in Sacramento since he moved to LA.
Yeah, that's this
it's
guy.
me.
Yeah.
So that's not a good thing. There needs to be more. So thank you very much for
Thank you.
coming. Thank you. Good to see you too. Yeah.